You're exactly the kind of dinosaur we're trying to evolve past, my new CEO said into the microphone. 400 employees watching, every regional manager on the video call. My wife listening from the back row because I told her this morning felt different. He wasn't wrong that something was ending. He just had no idea what. I didn't stand up, didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him from my seat in the third row and said, "Before you continue, could you ask legal to pull up Section 9, Paragraph C of my original consulting to hire agreement?" That's when a $16 million logistics operation went dark. But let me back up. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 53 years old, and I've been optimizing supply chains since most of the people in that room were still figuring out how to drive. I came up through the docks at a regional distribution hub in Ohio, learned routing by hand before any of it was digital, and spent the better part of 2 decades turning chaotic delivery networks into something that actually worked. Not on paper. In the real world, where roads close and trucks break down and clients call at 2 in the morning because their inventory is somewhere between Columbus and Pittsburgh and nobody knows exactly where. I joined Hargrove Distribution 8 years ago when the founder, a man named Gerald Hargrove, called me because his nephew had crashed 3 trucks in 1 quarter through bad routing decisions, and he needed someone to fix it before the insurance company dropped them entirely. Gerald was 71, built like a retired linebacker, and shook hands like he meant it. I fixed the routing problem in 6 weeks. He asked me to stay. We shook hands again. What I built over those 8 years was the kind of system that looks invisible when it works. And it always worked. Dynamic route optimization across 42 drivers, real-time load balancing between 4 distribution hubs, a predictive maintenance schedule that cut our fleet downtime by 63% in the first 3 years. I called it DART, Distribution and Routing Tracker. Gerald called it the reason we were still in business. The thing about Gerald was he understood what he didn't understand. He didn't pretend to know how the system worked. He just knew it did, and he treated that knowledge with respect. When I told him we needed to upgrade the server infrastructure, he signed off without a PowerPoint presentation. When I said a certain client's delivery window was going to break the Eastern Hub's capacity model, he called the client himself and renegotiated. We worked well together because he trusted the people who knew things he didn't. Then Gerald had a stroke in March of last year. He recovered, mostly, but his doctor told him the stress of running the operation was going to kill him before his grandchildren grew up. So he sold 51% of the company to a private equity group out of Atlanta called Meridian Capital Partners. Gerald kept a stake and a seat on the board, but the day-to-day was over for him. Meridian sent us a new CEO 3 months later. His name was Brandon Kessler. 38 years old, MBA from Emory. Previously ran a regional grocery chain that Meridian had acquired and flipped in 18 months for a profit that looked good on paper and left the employees without pensions. Brandon wore fitted blazers over open-collar shirts and described everything he didn't understand as friction. Traffic was friction. Long-tenured employees were friction. My system, which he had never once sat down to understand, was friction. He introduced himself to the company at an all-hands meeting in June. Standing ovation from the people who hadn't met him yet. I clapped twice, which was honest. The first sign was small. Brandon's assistant sent a calendar invite for a technology modernization review, which I was not on. This was a meeting about our entire digital infrastructure. I built the digital infrastructure. When I mentioned the oversight to Brandon's assistant, she said Brandon preferred to gather perspectives without incumbents in the room. Incumbents. That was the word she used. I had been at Hargrove for 8 years. I was apparently the incumbent. The second sign came 2 weeks later. A consulting firm called Vantage Digital Solutions set up in the conference room on the 2nd floor. 4 consultants, none of them older than 32, all of them carrying matching laptop bags with the Vantage logo embroidered on the side. They were there to conduct a systems audit, Brandon explained at the next leadership meeting. Fresh eyes, objective perspective, innovation forward thinking. I asked Brandon if the audit team had any background in logistics routing specifically. He said they had experience across multiple verticals. I asked which verticals. He said hospitality and retail primarily. I nodded and wrote that down. The lead consultant's name was Marcus Webb, 29 years old, 2 years out of a graduate program in digital strategy, the kind of smart that comes from reading about systems rather than running them. He was pleasant enough in a careful, watchful way. The kind of pleasant that means someone is deciding how useful you are. We met once in the break room. He asked me how long DART had been in production. I told him 8 years. He nodded and wrote something in a notebook. What he wrote, I found out later, was that the system was too old to scale and needed replacement. He had been at the company for 4 days. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched the pattern I had seen before in other places, just slower and more expensive this time. The Vantage team presented Brandon with a roadmap for a platform they called Hargrove Next, new technology stack, cloud-native architecture, real-time dashboards with the kind of visual design that impresses people in conference rooms. The demo looked impressive. The demo always looks impressive. Demos don't have to handle 42 drivers rerouting simultaneously when a jackknifed semi closes I-70 eastbound on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Brandon loved it. He started using phrases like transformational infrastructure and digital-first culture in every meeting. He referenced Hargrove Next the way Gerald used to reference Dart, which was the point. Meanwhile, my invitations to operational planning meetings became less frequent. Then stopped. I found out about a routing policy change from one of my drivers, Carl, who'd been with the company 12 years and had the kind of loyalty that comes from never being lied to. He called me at 6:30 in the morning to say he'd gotten a new dispatch protocol in his app and nobody had told him what it meant. The new protocol had been pushed by Marcus's team without going through me. It was wrong, not directionally wrong. Wrong, the kind of wrong that would have put 3 trucks in the same loading dock at the same time on a Friday afternoon and created a backup that would have cost us a client contract. I fixed it quietly. Didn't make a scene. Just corrected the error in the system and sent Brandon a note explaining what had happened and why the change needed to go through me before being deployed. He forwarded the note to Marcus. Marcus sent back a reply that included the phrase, "operational resistance to modernization." I kept the email chain. I kept everything. That was around the time I sat down one evening and pulled out the contract I had signed when I joined Hargrove 8 years ago. Gerald and I had negotiated it directly before he brought in an outside HR firm. Back when the company was small enough that a handshake wasn't enough, but a 50-page legal document felt excessive. We'd used a local attorney named Phil Dawson, who was thorough and unhurried and believed that employment agreements should say what they meant. One of the things we had negotiated was straightforward. I was coming in as a consultant first, with a conversion to full employee status after 1 year. During the consulting period, any proprietary systems I designed and built remained my intellectual property unless specifically transferred in writing. The conversion agreement, signed at the end of year 1, had included a clause that Phil had insisted on and Gerald had agreed to without complaint. Section 9, paragraph C. In the event of termination without cause, any proprietary systems, algorithms, or software architectures developed by the employee that are integral to core business operations shall revert to sole ownership of said employee, with the company retaining a limited operational license for a period not to exceed 90 days, after which continued use requires a separately negotiated licensing agreement. Gerald had read it, asked Phil 2 questions, and signed it. He told me afterward that it seemed fair. If they ever fired me for no good reason, I should get to keep what I'd built. That made sense to him. He was that kind of man. I had forgotten about that clause for 7 years because I never thought I would need it. Now I thought about it every day. The thing about Section 9, paragraph C was that it only applied if they terminated me without cause. As long as I kept working there, kept drawing a salary, kept showing up to the meetings I was still sometimes invited to, the clause was theoretical. It existed on paper but did nothing in practice. The only way it activated was if Brandon decided to fire me publicly and call it evolution. I started documenting everything after that. Not frantically, not out of panic, methodically, the way you build any good system. Every commit log with my credentials, every architecture decision document with my signature. The original source code repository for Dart, archived and timestamped. Patent filings from year 3, when Gerald had encouraged me to formalize the routing optimization logic. Phil Dawson's original drafts of the consulting agreement showing the clause was my addition, not boilerplate. I had been building Dart for 8 years. I knew every dependency, every integration point, every silent failure mode that Marcus's team would never find until it was too late. The system was not a black box to me. It was my handwriting. My wife Carol found me at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock one night with a folder of printed documents spread across the surface. She had been a high school principal for 14 years. She knew what it looked like when a decision had already been made and the paperwork was catching up. She sat down across from me. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just looked at the papers and then at me. I told her I thought Brandon was building towards something, that the Vantage consultants were the setup, and I was the punchline. That the all-hands meeting Brandon had scheduled for the third week of September, with the board present and Gerald invited back as a guest, had a particular shape to it that I recognized. She asked me what I was planning. I told her I wasn't planning anything. I was just making sure I was prepared. She said that sounded like planning. I told her she wasn't wrong. The September all-hands was held in the main warehouse on a Thursday morning. Brandon had brought in folding chairs and a proper sound system. A banner above the loading dock doors read, "Hargrove Distribution, the next chapter." Gerald was seated in the front row in a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who used to be bigger. He looked tired and proud at the same time, the way founders look when they watch someone else take the wheel. I had picked a seat in the third row. Center section. Good sight lines. Carol was in the back by the exit, which she had agreed to after I explained that I might need her to witness something, and she had agreed after I explained more specifically what that something might be. Brandon opened by thanking everyone for being there and talking about momentum and vision and the exciting chapter ahead. He used the word transformational 4 times in the first 6 minutes. I counted. He spent 20 minutes on Hargrove Next. The slides were genuinely beautiful. Marcus stood to one side of the stage, nodding the way junior consultants nod when they want to appear senior. The demo showed trucks moving across a map in real time, routes recalculating smoothly, dashboards updating with the kind of visual elegance that means someone spent a lot of time on the front end and very little time on the back end. Then Brandon got to the part about organizational alignment. He said every transformation requires honest assessment of where the company's strengths really lie. He said that honoring the past sometimes means recognizing that certain approaches have reached their natural ceiling. He advanced to a slide that had my title on it. Senior Systems Architect. He said my name. He said I had made important foundational contributions during the company's earlier phase. He said the word earlier the way you say it when you mean over. He said as Hargrove moved into a technology-forward future, we needed leadership that could build from the ground up rather than from the inside of systems that were already aging out. He said the word dinosaur. He was smiling when he said it. The kind of smile that expects the room to smile back. Some people in the room did smile. The ones who had been at the company less than 2 years. The ones who didn't know what happened to deliveries on the Eastern Corridor before I rebuilt the routing logic. Gerald in the front row was not smiling. Brandon said my name again and asked me to stand so everyone could thank me for my years of service. I stayed seated. He chuckled. He said my name a third time. He said, "Come on, it's not that kind of goodbye." I looked at him from my chair in the third row and said, "Before we continue, could you have your legal counsel pull up Section 9, Paragraph C of my original consulting to hire agreement?" The chuckle stopped. He said this wasn't really the time for contract discussions. I said I understood, but it was relevant to the transition he was describing, and it would only take a moment. He looked at the company's outside counsel, a woman named Janet Flores, who was sitting to the right of the stage with a tablet on her lap. She had gone very still. I said her name and said the section and paragraph again, clearly the way you say something you have said to yourself many times in private. She opened her tablet. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear people deciding whether to breathe. Janet read it. She read it twice. The second time was slower. Then she looked up at Brandon and said, "This clause is valid. It's signed, it's dated, and it was board approved as part of his conversion agreement." "What does that mean?" someone said from the investor section. Meridian had sent 2 representatives. They were standing along the wall and they were no longer looking relaxed. Janet said it meant that a termination without cause activated a reversion clause covering DART and its related architecture. That the company would retain an operational license for 90 days, but continued use after that required a separate licensing agreement. Brandon said that was just legacy language, that it was a formality from before the company scaled. Janet said it was binding and countersigned, and she wished someone had brought it to her before this meeting. Gerald turned in his front row chair and looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the way men nod when something confirms what they already suspected. I opened the application on my phone. I had built a simple interface for exactly this purpose. Nothing dramatic, just a clean toggle connected to DART's authentication layer. I pressed it. 47 seconds. That's how long it took for every dispatch terminal in all 4 hubs to stop responding. Every driver's routing app went to an authentication screen. The real-time load balancing dashboard that Marcus's team had been using as a reference for Hargrove Next went dark. The predictive maintenance alerts that kept our fleet from failing on the road, gone. Everything that ran on my architecture, which was everything that mattered, now required credentials that only I held. From the stage, Brandon watched his presentation slides replaced by a single error message on the screen behind him. DART authentication required. Contact system administrator. Someone in the room said, "Oh my God," quietly. The Meridian representatives were on their phones immediately. One of them walked outside without excusing himself. Brandon gripped the microphone. He said this was sabotage. He said it was destruction of company property. Janet said, loudly enough for the room to hear, that the clause was clear, that until a licensing agreement was in place, DART was Daniel Marsh's intellectual property, and he was within his legal rights to restrict access. Gerald stood up slowly from his front row chair. He was 72 years old and moved like a man saving his effort for important moments. He said, "Brandon, you should have read his contract." The room didn't laugh. Nobody laughed. Brandon came down from the stage and walked straight toward me, close enough that I could see the effort it took him to keep his voice controlled. He said I was going to destroy everything he was building. I said I hadn't built anything to destroy, that he was the one who had called me a dinosaur in front of 400 people without reading a document that had been in his files since the day he arrived. I said I was open to a licensing conversation. He said I was being vindictive. I said I was being a business owner, and there was a difference, and he should have thought about that before the banner and the sound system and the word transformational. I walked out through the warehouse, past the trucks I had spent 8 years routing efficiently, past the loading dock doors that had moved $100 million in freight under schedules I designed. Carol met me at the exit. She didn't say anything until we reached the parking lot. Then she said, "You've been planning this for a long time." I said since January, when Marcus wrote operational resistance in his notebook after talking to me for 4 minutes. She said we should get coffee somewhere far from here. We did. The calls started before I finished my first cup. Brandon first, then someone from Meridian I didn't recognize, then Janet. I let them go to voicemail. I had already drafted the initial licensing terms. I had done that 2 weeks earlier, sitting at the kitchen table after Carol went to sleep, because good preparation means having the document ready before you need it. Janet called 4 times within the first 2 hours. On the 5th call I picked up. She sounded like someone who had been in difficult conversations before, but found this one particularly taxing. She said the board had convened an emergency call. She said the Meridian partners were upset about the market exposure. She said 3 of our top 5 clients had called the main line that morning when their vendor portals went down. I said I was sorry to hear that, and that I had designed DART to fail safely, so none of the physical operations were at risk, just the software layer. She asked what it would take to restore service. I told her I had sent a term sheet to her email 14 minutes ago. She said she'd seen it. I asked if she had questions. She said the board was going to find it steep. I said the board had had 8 years to understand what they were sitting on and had apparently spent none of that time reading one contract, so I was comfortable with the number. She said she'd get back to me. Gerald called that afternoon, not from a blocked number, just his personal cell, the same number he'd been calling me from for 8 years. He said he was sorry it had gone this way. He said he'd told Meridian when they brought Brandon in that there were things about the operation they didn't understand yet, and that the smart move was to learn before reorganizing. I told him I knew that, and that it wasn't his fault. He asked if I was going to be all right. I said I thought so. I said I had been thinking about this moment for a while and had some things in motion. He said that sounded like me. He said he was glad I'd read the contract. I said he was the one who signed it. He laughed for the first time in what sounded like months. The licensing agreement was executed 4 days later. Monthly payments, paid in advance, minimum 6-month term. The number was significant enough that one of the Meridian partners called it highway robbery on a call I was not supposed to be on, but whose voicemail was forwarded to me by someone I still respected at the company. I restored full service within an hour of the wire clearing. Then I called Tom Reedy. Tom and I had worked together briefly at a freight logistics firm in Cincinnati 12 years ago. He had spent the last 6 years running routing operations for a mid-sized carrier in Kentucky that got absorbed by a national conglomerate and summarily dismissed all 3 of its senior technical staff, citing redundancy. He was 51, precise and angrier about it than he admitted when you first asked. I told him what had happened. I told him what I was thinking. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said he'd been thinking something similar for 2 years, but hadn't had the capital. I told him to look at my bank statement. He said, "Well," I said, "exactly." We incorporated ClearPath Logistics Solutions 8 weeks later. Clean architecture, written from the ground up, designed specifically for mid-market distribution companies that were too complex for off-the-shelf routing software and too lean to maintain enterprise platforms. Most importantly, every piece of IP that any engineer on our team produced was documented and attributed. We built it into our operating agreement from day one, the same principle, because Tom and I both understood what happens when that conversation happens too late. Our first client was a regional food distributor in Indiana that had been using a patchwork of legacy systems held together by one systems administrator who had just announced his retirement. They needed something that actually worked, and someone who understood why the current mess had been built the way it was. We gave them both. My son, who was a junior at Ohio State studying supply chain management, called me the week after we signed the Indiana client. He had seen something circulating online about DART and what had happened at the All Hands. Someone had posted a secondhand account in a logistics industry forum, and it had spread in that specific way that professional communities spread stories about things they recognize. He asked if it was true that I had locked down the whole system from my phone. I said it was true. He asked if I had planned it from the beginning. I said I had planned to be prepared, that the planning and the timing were things other people decided for me. He asked if I felt bad about it. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Carl calling me at 6:30 in the morning about a routing protocol that would have put 3 trucks in the same dock. I thought about 8 years of solutions that worked, attributed to a vision and a platform and a transformation that had nothing to do with how any of it actually functioned. I said no. He said he was going to use it as an example in his operations management class. I said just make sure they read the primary source document, not the forum post. The Hargrove licensing arrangement ran for 8 months before Brandon was removed. Meridian installed an interim COO, a woman named Patricia Okafor who had actual logistics experience and had clearly been briefed thoroughly on the situation before she arrived. She called me in her second week and asked to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my home office and the company's main hub. She ordered black coffee and didn't waste time. She said she had read everything, the consulting agreement, the conversion contract, the clause, all of it. She said she wanted to understand how an organization could have a dependency that significant and not know about it. I said it was easy when the person who built the dependency was also the person who maintained it, and when nobody in leadership thought to ask what happened if that person left. She said that was a significant operational risk. I said it was, and that I had flagged it twice in writing during my time there, and that both times the response had been to thank me for my diligence and move on to the next agenda item. She pulled out a folder. She said Meridian wanted to discuss an acquisition of the IP and a formal licensing structure, potentially long-term. I said I was flattered, but ClearPath had been incorporated for 11 weeks and we had already signed 2 clients, and I was no longer interested in licensing to my former employer. I was interested in building something new and owning it completely. She nodded. She didn't seem surprised. She said she understood and asked if I would be willing to consult on the transition to whatever replacement platform they ended up using. I said I would, at a rate that reflected my hourly value accurately. She said she expected nothing less. We shook hands. She left first. I finished my coffee and thought about Gerald, who would have done the same thing, and who had taught me by example that the people who actually understand the work are not always the people in the front row. Brandon Kessler left Hargrove 11 days after Patricia arrived. His LinkedIn post about the departure described it as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. 3 months later, I saw he had founded a consulting firm called Kessler Strategic Advisors. The website described him as a transformation expert with deep experience in operational modernization. It did not name any specific clients. As of the last time I checked, it still doesn't. Marcus Webb and the Vantage team completed their contract and were not renewed. I heard through industry contacts that the Hargrove Next platform had been shelved after it failed a stress test during peak delivery season. Not enough edge case handling. Too much elegance, not enough depth. The kind of failure that's obvious to anyone who has ever actually worked the problem. Carl, who had been with Hargrove for 12 years, came to work for ClearPath in month 4. He brought 2 other drivers with him, both of whom had been at Hargrove longer than Brandon Kessler had been in the industry. I did not recruit them. They called me. I picked up. By the end of our first year, ClearPath had 9 employees, 3 active clients, and a pipeline that had Tom working 7 days a week and complaining about it only occasionally. We had turned down 2 acquisition inquiries because neither of them understood what they were trying to buy. The third inquiry, from a regional logistics company in Pennsylvania looking for a technology partnership rather than an acquisition, turned into something worth talking about seriously. We were still talking. My wife asked me one night, about a year after the all-hands meeting, whether I missed working inside a company. The structure, the team, the sense of being part of something larger. I said I missed some of it. I missed Gerald. I missed the version of the company that had existed before Brandon Kessler walked in with a whiteboard and a vocabulary full of words that meant nothing. She asked if I was happy. I said I was building something that belonged to me, where the people who built things had their names on them, where a 29-year-old consultant with a notebook could not call anyone's 8 years of work friction and have it mean anything. She said that sounded like a yes. I said it was a yes. The industry changed some after what happened, the way industries quietly change when something goes public enough to be embarrassing. Employment attorneys started getting more calls from senior technical staff asking questions about IP clauses. A few trade publications ran pieces about operational dependency risk and knowledge transfer. One piece interviewed me, briefly and without naming the company, about the importance of documentation and attribution in technical roles. I told the reporter the same thing I told my son: read what you sign. Document what you build. Not for leverage, not for protection, just for accuracy. The record of who built what matters more than most people think. And by the time it matters, it's usually too late to start keeping it. She asked if I had any advice for people currently in situations like mine, where they were being pushed out of something they had built. I said, figure out what you own before someone else decides for you. She asked if that was what I had done. I said I had done it 5 years before I needed it, which was the only way it works. The last time I heard from anyone at the old company was a brief email from Gerald, forwarded from his personal account because he had apparently given up on the company email. He said he was doing well, that the grandchildren were loud and wonderful, and that he had heard ClearPath was growing. He said he had one more thing to say, and that he hoped I would take it as the compliment it was intended to be. He said he had never once in 8 years worried about the trucks. I wrote back and told him that was the whole point. 53 years old, building something from the ground up for the second time, with better paperwork this time and a clearer understanding of which words in a contract are theoretical and which ones are load-bearing. The difference between the two is not complicated. It just requires the patience to read all the way to Section 9, Paragraph C. Brandon Kessler never read past the cover page. I still read everything.